Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second talk of the morning. I'm in the position of having to introduce myself. John Vennari, I think everybody knows who I am. John Vennari, editor of Catholic Family News. And the name of my presentation is The New Paganism and the War Against Life. One of the saddest stories I ever heard was something I heard in this room a year ago. It was at last year's Fatima conference, the Fatima Challenge, held by the Fatima Center in the talk given by retired Bishop Manuel Pestana from Brazil, who died in January of this year, God rest his soul. Bishop Pestana related an episode where he was addressing the Brazilian Bishops' Conference, urging them to fight abortion. And here's how they responded. He said, "The bishops told me, Don Pestana, you have to understand, we cannot lose battles, courage, or ideals for a battle that's already lost. Abortion is now here. It's been approved by almost every nation. Let's not waste our time on such things." So, look at what's going on here. We have the bishops from what used to be one of the largest Catholic countries in the world just giving up the battle against abortion, giving up the battle to save innocent babies from wanton slaughter, saying it's already lost, let's not waste our time on such things. This is not the language of the church militant. It is not the language of men of faith. It is not the language of true leadership. It is the language of callousness, compromise, and cowardice. And Bishop Pestana gave the bishops a good answer. He said to them, God does not judge us whether or not we win battles, but if we fight well. And this is something that Father Paul Marks used to say too, the pro-life priest from the United States. He used to say that on the day of judgment, God's not going to ask us if we won, but if we tried. So this is, no matter what the consequences, the Catholic has the duty to keep fighting, especially the priest, especially the bishop, whose duty it is to protect his flock. He's duty-bound to protect his flock. Surrender is not an option. And we'll come back to the Brazilian bishops at the end of this talk. But what's happening here is these bishops, as well as too many others throughout the world, have caved in to the new paganism. Now, what is the new paganism? Well, there have been great men and women in the recent past who have warned in advance of the rise of godlessness and the godless and this inhuman period in which we live. One of the most keen-eyed warnings came from the renowned Catholic historian Hilaire Belloc in a magnificent essay he wrote in 1931 called The New Paganism. He was a true prophet. And here he makes the point that the central aspect of the old paganism was a profound respect for tradition, and the key element, the defining element of the new anti-Christian paganism is a revolutionary contempt for tradition. Here's what Belloc writes. He says, "The old paganism was profoundly traditional. Indeed, it had no roots except in tradition. Deep reverence for its own past and for the wisdom of its ancestry and for the pride therein were the very soul of the old paganism. And that is why it formed so solid a foundation on which to build the Catholic Church, and that is also why it offered so long a determined resistance to the growth of the Catholic Church. But the new paganism has for its very essence contempt for tradition and contempt for ancestry. It respects perhaps nothing, but least of all does it respect the spirit of 'our fathers have told us.'" Close quote. Now, throughout history, our fathers have told us to respect human life, that human life is precious, that it's a gift from God, that we have a duty to protect life, especially the most weak and vulnerable, and that we may not treat human life as if it were merely animal life. Our great fathers, whether they be the fathers and doctors and learned men of the church, or the great philosophers such as Aristotle, or even upright statesmen who accept at least except the natural law. They have told us these things, and they've told us these things not simply because they were pretty and made our hearts pound and made us feel good, but they told us these things because they are true. But the new paganism has no respect for what our fathers taught us, and the new paganism certainly has no respect for what our Father who art in heaven has told us regarding the commandments, thou shalt not kill. The central tenets of the new paganism come from the forces of organized naturalism warned against by the popes of the past, especially by Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical against Freemasonry Humanum Genus, and by Father Denis Vei. Now, on the subject of naturalism, the great Cardinal Pia of Poitiers of the 19th century, he explained in strong, clear language the insidious nature of this naturalism. He says, naturalism is more than a heresy. It is pure, undiluted anti-Christianism. Heresy denies one or more dogma. Naturalism denies that there are any dogmas or that there can be any. Heresy alters more or less what God has revealed. Naturalism denies the very existence of revelation. It follows that the inevitable law and the obstinate passion of naturalism is to dethrone our Lord Jesus Christ, to drive him from the world. This will be the task of Antichrist, and it is Satan's ambition. The great obstacle to the salvation of men of our day, as Vatican Council I points out in the First Constitutional Doctrine, what hurls more people into hell nowadays than at any other epoch is rationalism and naturalism. Naturalism strives with all its might to exclude our Lord Jesus Christ, our one Master and Savior, from the minds of men, as well as from the daily lives and habits of people, in order to set up the reign of reason and of nature. Now, wherever the breath of naturalism has passed, the very source of Christian life has dried up. Naturalism means complete sterility in regard to salvation and eternal life. Close quote. And in a dramatic manner that really drives the point home regarding naturalism, the French Bishop Gaume in 1877, he gave us what we could call the personification of the Masonic Revolution. Now, this is what I'm about to say. This is the revolution speaking. It says, I am not what you think I am. Many speak of me, but few know me. I am not Freemasonry, nor rioting, nor the changing of the monarchy into a republic, nor the substitution of one dynasty for another, not temporary disturbance of public order. I am not the shouts of Jacobins, nor the fury of the Montague, nor the fighting on the barricades, nor pillage, nor arson, nor agricultural law, nor the guillotine, nor the drownings. I am neither Murat, nor Robespierre, nor Babeuf, nor Mazzini, nor Cousaut. These men are my sons, but they are not me. These things are my works, but they are not me. These men and these things are passing objects, but I am a permanent state. I am the hatred of all order not established by man, in which he himself is not both king and God. Close quote. See, this is the true nature of naturalism, and this is an accurate description for our times. We increasingly live in a social order that is more and more established by man, with no reference to God and his commandments. We increasingly live in a social order in which man is both sovereign and God. And this is why we live in a society where laws are established, so-called laws, such as abortion, such as the increasing acceptance of euthanasia, that are based sheerly on human will, what I want, what is convenient for me, what is of utilitarian advantage, and takes no account of God and his eternal law into consideration. It is a manifestation of the new paganism warned of by Belloc. Now, regarding these anti-God, anti-human laws, we reject them because they are not true laws at all. Pope Leo XIII, in his magnificent encyclical Sapientia Christiana, he reinforces this truth, basing himself on our Lord's words that no man can serve two masters, and on St. Peter in Acts 5, that we ought to obey God rather than man. Pope Leo writes, quote, "But if the laws of the state are manifestly at variance with the divine law, containing enactments hurtful to the church, or conveying injunctions adverse to the duties imposed by religion, then truly to resist becomes a positive duty, to obey a crime." So we have the words of Leo XIII, that resistance to unjust laws such as legalized abortion is a positive duty. To obey, and I will add, to cooperate, is a crime. The new paganism, otherwise known as the powerful forces of organized naturalism, are constantly working to degrade human life, to destroy human life, all in the name of social engineering and population control. This anti-life program holds that human life does not have value in itself, but only a contingent value based on the quality of life, in the case of the sick or the elderly or severely deformed, or whether or not that human life is wanted, in the case of a woman, a mother, deciding to abort her baby. And if human life is deemed not worth living, it can be destroyed. Now, the true nature of this new approach was manifest openly, in a now infamous pro-abortion editorial that appeared in a USA publication called California Medicine, September 1970, volume 113, number 3. Now, the editorial was published 3 years before Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court decided on Roe versus Wade that supposedly legalized abortion. And it's crucial to know this editorial because it admits openly the truth about abortion and also lays out the strategy that had to be employed in order for public acceptance of abortion. And what this California Medicine editorial did is it contrasted the traditional ethic with the new ethic. It says that the traditional Western ethic has always placed great emphasis on the intrinsic worth and equal value of every human life, regardless of its stage or condition. This ethic, and this is the journal speaking, this ethic is blessed and reinforced by Christian heritage and has been the basis for most of our laws and our social policies. But now, they said, we see the emergence of a new ethic that focuses on what is called the quality of life, that places a relative value on human life and not an absolute value. And as I said, this is very useful to us because in discussing abortion, the editorial says we all know when human life begins. The editorial does not say, it's a pro-abortion editorial, but it doesn't say, oh, we don't know when human life begins. We don't know if we're really taking a life. Is it killing? No, the magazine knows the answer. The editorial says everyone really knows that human life begins at conception and is continuous, whether intra or extrauterine, until death. Says it openly. So the question of when human life begins is not the problem. The problem is that there are still too many people in society who are still stuck in this old Western ethic that killing is sociably abhorrent, that killing is wrong. And the editorial says, again, 1970, 3 years before Roe v. Wade, the editorial says that if the abortion movement is to succeed, it is necessary to separate the notion of abortion from the notion of killing. Separate the notion of abortion from the notion of killing. And this is when we began to hear all the new terminology, removing the fetus, never call it a baby, removing the product of conceptus, termination of pregnancy. As Monsignor Smith used to say, you call it anything, but don't call it killing. This is where we get the term pro-choice. It's an example of separating the notion of abortion from the notion of killing. But abortion is not an issue of a woman's choice. It's an issue of killing the most innocent and defenseless, the baby in her womb. Pro-choice is a term, we should expunge it from our vocabulary. Never use that term in writing, in public, in speeches, in conversation. It's the enemy's terminology that shifts the emphasis away from what we're really dealing with, which is willful murder, which is one of the four sins crying to heaven for vengeance. But again, back to that main point in California medicine, for the abortion movement to succeed, it is crucial to separate the notion of abortion from the notion of killing. This is the strategy that has been employed, and it has worked. And now we see the same thing taking place on the other end of life. Instead of calling euthanasia and assisted suicide killing, which it is, it's sold to us as all this positive term, the right to die, death with dignity, painless release. It's been given a positive slant to cover what's really happening, direct killing. And killing is offered as a solution to a problem. Now, here's the difficulty. Once we say that abortion or euthanasia is listed in my life as a solution to a personal problem, then what is to stop governments from enforcing the same barbarity to remedy what a given government considers to be a problem? When Pope Paul VI reinforced the Church's condemnation of artificial birth control in 1968 in Humanae Vitae, he warned that if birth control was considered licit, then what is to prevent governments from incorporating birth control into public policy? And this has happened and continues to happen in the United States and elsewhere. If abortion is legal, then what is to prevent governments from forcing abortion on its citizens as a means of population control, as you all know is going on with the monstrous one-child policy in China? In fact, in late April, just last month, China confirmed, contrary to rumors that were going around, that it will maintain its one-child policy. And if euthanasia, the killing of the elderly, the terminally ill, the severely handicapped, if this is recognized as good and legal, then what is to prevent governments from enforcing euthanasia measures on the population? And this is why, speaking as an American, many of us have a legitimate fear of the so-called death panels that is in the new Obama health care legislation. Because we all know it, the right to die will soon become the duty to die. The duty for the elderly and the terminally ill to get out of the way, because not to be a drain on time, not to be a drain on expenses. And this is where we are. We're headed towards a physician deciding or a committee deciding on their own that this life is not worth living and snuffing it out. And as I said, it's where we are right now. In the Netherlands, where euthanasia has been legal for decades, the Dutch government itself released a 1991 report and reported that there have been, with the legalization, over 25,000 cases of euthanasia in the Netherlands, and that of these more than 25,000 cases, 14,691 of these were by involuntary euthanasia. The doctor simply killed the patient or allowed the patient to die. And that in these nearly 15,000 cases of involuntary euthanasia, the 4,941 cases where lethal overdose of morphine was administered without the patient's knowledge, they were listed on this treatment was listed under the subsection pain relief. So this is how you relieve someone's pain. You just put them out. These facts are from the report of the Dutch Government Committee on Euthanasia, printed in the journal Issues in Law and Medicine, Volume 7, Number 3, 1991. And in response to this report, the Dutch government, they made some stricter laws, but nobody pays attention to them. But in order to demonstrate that this euthanasia-friendly thinking in the medical profession is both real and not new to our generation, I want to read the following from a book co-authored by two professionals, one a physician and the other a legal scholar. Quote, arguments for this legislation, that is the termination of life of another person, arguments for this legislation have recently been heard, and the motto of this movement has become the right to die with dignity. By death with dignity, we don't only mean the right to death with dignity, but much more. The legally acknowledged right to the complete relief of an unbearable life. Close quote. Now, where did this quote come from? Is it from Dr. Jack Kevorkian or Princeton's pagan Professor Peter Singer? Or is it from Derek Humphrey, the founder of the Hemlock Society, who killed his own wife under the specious rubric of assisted suicide? No, it's taken from a book written in 1920 in Leipzig, Germany, that's titled, revealing title, The Release of the Destruction of Life Devoid of Value. It was written by legal scholar Dr. Carl Binding and physician Dr. Alfred Hoch. The book catalyzed the development of the euthanasia movement in Germany during the Weimar Republic, which was the democracy that governed Germany from World War I to the rise of Hitler. See, the point is, Hitler did not invent euthanasia. He simply utilized its inherent potential for genocide in the extreme. And in an article on the subject written in 1991, Professor of Philosophy Dr. Dennis Bennett pointed out how the book, The Release of the Destruction of Life Devoid of Value, develops the euthanasia arguments. When you're going to hear them, you're going to see there are shocking parallels to right now, to today. First, as with the arguments today, I'm just going to call the book Release from now on. Release starts with the defense of suicide. It claims that man is born sovereign of his life, and we echo back to this when the revolution told us what it was. We are sovereign. Man is sovereign. Same thing here. He is born sovereign of his life, and this reveals euthanasia's foundational atheism, because man is not sovereign of his own life, but rather life is a gift from God, and only God can taketh away. The fifth commandment says, thou shalt not kill, and the full understanding of the fifth commandment is, thou shalt not directly take the life of the innocent or the helpless. So that's the first point. Second point, the authors of Release next deal directly with euthanasia. They say, quote, it is only important to consider the change of a painful cause of death originating in an often life-lasting illness to a less painful but different cause of death. So when the author suggests change to a less painful but different form of death, the authors are talking about a kind helper. That's what they call it. In other words, a lethal injection that will cause death that the authors say it's going to happen anyway. We're just going to change the direction and bring it forward. And they even go so far as to claim that this is not killing, but natural healing. So they're redefining the terms. Number three, Release relies on an ends justifies the mean rationale. End justifies the means. Dr. Binding writes, he says, we're not dealing here with an unlawful killing, but with an unprohibited healing action carried out with the blessing of the sufferer as a pain relief for the nearly dead, since it's not done for the purpose of killing them, but to relieve suffering. You see, they always sound so kind. We want to relieve suffering, but they're advocating suicide and murder. And four, here is where we have to end up. Dr. Binding proceeds from advocating voluntary euthanasia to enforced euthanasia. Here's what Binding says. He says that granting death with dignity is not dependent on the consent of the tortured or sick person. So you see what's happened. We've moved from a defense of suicide to a defense of murder, taking human life without the consent of the victim. Remember the report I just read from the Netherlands, the 1991 report. Number five, we move then to advocating taking the life of incurable idiots, no matter if they have been born this way or if they have become like that at the last stage of their suffering. That's a direct quote from the book. And with real German efficiency, he suggests that it would be best to apply for death with dignity as soon as the incurable idiocy has been confirmed. As soon as you know this is incurable, just take them out. This is to apply to young and old, and then he takes the next logical step. He suggests that we should extend this charity, calls it charity, extend this charity to those born severely deformed. And then from here, we move to where you know we were going to go, the economic argument. And this was really advanced by co-author Dr. Hook. Now remember again, this is written during the time of the Weimar Republic, 1920, in a democratic state, not under Nazism. This is a democratic state speaking, post-World War I Germany. And Dr. Hook calls for the consideration of cost in keeping incurable idiots alive. Here's what he says. He says, concerning the economy, those full idiots are imposing the greatest burden on the environment and society, while at the same time they are serviced by persons who are able to live normal lives. So it's wasting their time too. I have found that the average expenditure per idiot, so we have a new economic unit, an EPI, expenditure per idiot. I have found that the average expenditure per idiot for a year is 1,300 marks. So this introduces the principle that it's just cheaper, more efficient to kill the idiots rather than have society bear the cost of keeping them alive. Now, in his article on the topic, Dr. Bonnet also quotes, bringing it up more to the present, a representative from Florida in the United States, a Representative Sackett. He's a physician and sponsor of Florida euthanasia laws, and he talks about the same thing, the cost of keeping the severely retarded alive artificially for 50 years. He says it's going to cost the various states over the same period $100 billion. And when one thinks of what one could do with this money in other fields, it's a question of cost benefit. So, those are the 6 stages of euthanasia contained in the release of the destruction of life devoid of value. Again, first, man is, you see how it moves. First, man is sovereign over his own life. Second, we should make it possible for the elderly or those severely ill to choose an alternative manner of death by means of a kind helper. In other words, a lethal injection. Third, this is defended through an ends justifies the means argument, providing we have the consent of the sufferer. So this is where we get the justification of so-called assisted suicide. Fourth, from there we move to advancing death with dignity without the consent of the sufferer, without the consent of the victim. Fifth, from there we move to advocating terminating the life of the incurable idiots, and we should do this as soon as we learn that their condition is incurable. And then sixth, the economic motive. It's too expensive to keep this hopelessly ill, these incurable idiots, these useless eaters alive, so it's best to terminate them with or without their consent. You see, the right to die has become the duty to die. Hitler did not invent these eugenic principles. They were formulated and published in a free democracy. Hitler, monster that he was, just picked up this ready-made formula and applied it with full force. Now, the question is, can today's civic leaders be trusted to ensure that euthanasia measures do not happen in the nations of the world? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. It doesn't look good. Take my own country. In 2008, the United States elected the most pro-abortion senator in the country's history, who went on to become the most pro-abortion president in U.S. history, Barack Obama, who was completely beholden to the abortion lobby, completely beholden to Planned Parenthood, completely beholden to the homosexual lobby. Obama's billionaire financial banker, George Soros, is a zealous advocate for euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide, so it's hard to imagine Soros backing Obama if Obama was not willing to pave the way for more euthanasia and assisted suicide in the United States. In fact, the Hemlock Society, which is the pro-euthanasia organization, the Hemlock Society had a hand in crafting part of Barack Obama's health care legislation. The European Union, the United Nations, they're all notoriously pro-abortion and pro-euthanasia. And I'll give some examples. All of these, every one of these examples are recent. They're from 2001. In the United Kingdom, A suicide documentary is being marketed to students aged 14 to 18. It's a so-called educational video that features euthanasia advocate Dr. Philip Nixke. He's known over there as Dr. Death. And in the video, he demonstrates his suicide machine for lethal injections and other suicide methods. This news is from April 20th, just a few weeks ago. The documentary's producers say, "We have had extremely positive response from pupils and teachers." So you see what's happening. The new generation constantly be informed to accept killing the sick, the elderly, the deformed. And this is a positive practice. Same country, United Kingdom. A so-called charity group called Compassion for Dying has set up a How to Die telephone helpline to help people learn how to kill themselves. This was reported in the London Mail, April 28, 2011, not even 3 weeks ago. News on other battles. March 18th this year, the Italian Chamber of Deputies commenced a debate on a new bill that will prohibit the starvation and dehydration of patients, even if the patient requested this in a living will. This is good news, but I've not been able to find an update on this bill, but recent polls show that 66% of Italians they support euthanasia. So there's massive public opinion campaigns going on to get people to accept the idea of euthanasia and assisted suicide. A bit of good news, the French Senate in January of this year voted down an assisted suicide bill. That's good news, but you have to remember the euthanasia, population control people, they'll be back again for another fight. The enemy never quits. We never can claim victory here. In Australia, this is from May 2nd, just last Monday, a week ago Monday. A billboard by a euthanasia advocacy group called Exit International, they ran in big, huge block letters, 85% of Australians support voluntary euthanasia. So this is part of creating a tyranny of public opinion so that anyone who opposes euthanasia and assisted suicide will be considered outside the mainstream of modern enlightened thought. And in India, for our friends in India here, March 2011, the Supreme Court passed a motion that saved a woman from lethal injection. That's active euthanasia, and that's good news. But the bad news is that the court also ruled to legalize passive euthanasia in certain circumstances. And passive euthanasia here means not only the removal of extraordinary life support systems, which is one thing, but also removing the feeding tubes that provide food and fluids so that grandmom or someone's wife or someone's mother is starved or dehydrated to death. And the last example of contempt for human life is not about coercive euthanasia measures, but coercive sterilization programs that comes from the same anti-life mindset. And this is something going on in Africa. In Rwanda, there is now a plan underway to sterilize 700,000 men over the next 3 decades. This is not a conspiracy. This is open news. It's being done in the name of population control and with the encouragement of groups funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. The BBC and Rwanda news outlets report that the Rwandan government is introducing the campaign on the heels of a large-scale effort to circumcise men. Now, somehow they claim the circumcision will protect them against AIDS. I don't quite know how that works, and I don't want to know. But as Rwandan health officials told the Rwandan Times newspaper, see, this is actually a ploy, because the Rwandan health minister told Rwanda News Times newspaper, he said, we included circumcision because it allows us to gain access to the men's reproductive systems, and in the process, we advise them on condom use and vasectomy. In 2008, Rwanda health officials told the BBC that circumcision campaigns would be first practiced on the newborn, young men in universities, the army, and the police. And this is a definite strategy because many in the armed forces, if they're told to do this by their senior officer, even if it's not a direct command, and even if you're dealing with something like vasectomy, they'll do it because they'll consider it an order, even though it's not a direct order. Stephen Mosher of the Population Research Institute said in February, He said the Rwandan government claims that it wants men to go willingly for sterilization, but it also has a hard quota of 700,000 vasectomies, which it wants to meet over the next 3 years. In our experience, every single time a sterilization campaign has had a target and a timetable, it inevitably involves coercion and other human rights abuses just as surely as night follows day. It's a closed quote from Stephen Mosher. Now we're going to take a quick look at euthanasia in 3 aspects of it. The fact that at first it destroys the medical profession, second, it's against natural law, and thirdly, it is against divine law. Legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide must be resisted because in the medical profession, it opens the doors for massive abuse, as you can imagine, and it also undermines the patient's trust in his doctor. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I know a doctor can kill me and get away with it, either to cover his mistakes or because he thinks my medical procedure will be too expensive and not worth his trouble, I'm going to be very careful which doctor I trust. Now, I can't remember where I read it, but it was about a year ago. I read a report written by a doctor, and he said that the medical profession has trends just like any other profession. He gave the example of tonsillectomies, that in the 60s, 1970s, it was the trend. I had my tonsils out. Everybody had their tonsils out. It was the trend for people to get their tonsils out, whether you really needed to do it or not, have it done or not. Now it's not done so much anymore. It was the trend, this doctor was saying. Another example of medical trends, how many people here in the United States remember the movie Sybil? Do you remember Sybil? About the 1976 movie, with the woman with multiple personalities? It was based on a true story. It was a television movie. It was a big splash, 1976. About a woman who supposedly had 16 different personalities. And she suffered from what they called this was multiple personality disorder, or MPD. Now, prior to the broadcast of Sybil, there were fewer than 100 cases of MPD reported in various medical journals in decades, going back to the 50s, not even 100. But after Sybil was broadcast, and MPD became a household word, the number of diagnoses of MPD skyrocketed. A psychiatrist named Dr. Elias Abujamra, he said, quote, as a result of the frenzy, rates of MPD climbed feverishly and suspiciously, reaching at the height of interest in the condition 1 to 2% of the U.S. population. That is several million. Close quote. The point is, multiple personality disorder became a trend, and millions were thought to be afflicted with it. Now, a similar trend will occur, and it has occurred, in the practice of euthanasia and assisted suicide. More and more, we will see doctors carry out the execution of patients who could have survived their illness with a little more treatment, who could have survived their pain with better pain relief treatment. But instead, they're condemned to die. It's already becoming the trend, as I said. For example, I don't know if you've heard of this, there is a case reported by Dr. Richard Fenixing in the Hastings Center report. It's the true case of a Dutch doctor who gave a lethal injection to a Catholic nun who was suffering from terminal illness. And the doctor assumed that the nun's religious convictions would prohibit her from asking him for euthanasia. So he said, well, so he just made the decision himself and killed her and basically said he did her a favor. I did something she wouldn't have asked for on her own. In February of this year, Dr. Francois Primeau, professor of psychiatry at Laval University and chief of gerontopsychiatry at the Hôtel Dieu in Lévis, this is in Canada, Hôtel Lévis Hospital, he warned that the legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide for extreme cases is a slippery slope to the widespread killing of newborn infants, the elderly, the depressed, and the mentally disabled. And he said this to the Quebec National Assembly Special Commission on the issue of dying with dignity, February 17th this year. He said that in the Netherlands, deaths by euthanasia had increased more than 45% from 2003 to 2009, and that in the Netherlands, I'm quoting here him now, Euthanasia has been performed on minors younger than 12 years old, on depressed patients, on handicapped newborns, and on patients suffering from mental illness. And he called the development very alarming. Well, that's putting it mildly. Brian P. Johnson, in his book Death as a Salesman, he lays out some of the real dangers for abuse and murder on a massive scale if euthanasia and assisted suicide are legalized. Also, these are not hypothetical problems. This is what's going on. First, as I said, it undermines the trust in the doctor-patient relationship. Second, patients may be less than honest about their illness if they know that it might cost them their lives. Third, there's the danger of mistaken diagnosis. He has this terminal case, we'll put him out of his misery, and then you find out it wasn't terminal, too late. Fourth, there is the risk of coercion, pressure placed on the terminally ill to hasten their own death. Sometimes, as you know, tragically, this comes from the patient's own family, to push him out of the way, push her out of the way. Fifth, there is the immediate danger for the frail, the disabled, and those unable to pay medical costs. And sixth, as I said earlier, there is the risk that the more it becomes socially acceptable, people will just opt for suicide, even for depression, or even in early stages of illness. There is the true story of Janet Adkins, 52-year-old woman in the United States. She was diagnosed with the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. Now, she was far from debilitated at this point. She was in very good health, but she was depressed about her diagnosis, and she happened to see Dr. Jack Kevorkian on the Geraldo television program. So she figured she wasn't going to wait for the infirmity to take hold. She would take matters into her own hands. So she made the arrangements. And then one day, she played a round of tennis with her 26-year-old son. She beat him at tennis, got in her car, drove the Jack Kevorkians, where she got his lethal injection, and she died instantly. This is where we can end up. Seventh, there is the outside pressure on the physician, such as cost cutting. I could tell you stories about a surgeon I knew, and the pressure that's placed on the doctors from the insurance companies, horrible stories, to keep costs down, even to the detriment of the patients. Real problem. And number 8, there is the temptation for overworked doctors to quietly kill patients, which would be easier than continuing to treat a serious chronic illness that mom or dad is suffering. Now, I'm not saying all doctors are like this, but this is a mindset that's becoming more common, too common. The potential for abuse, as we already saw in the Netherlands, is colossal. Now, also, as you know, euthanasia and assisted suicide are against both natural law and divine law. We have to remember the truth that suicide is a mortal sin. Assisting someone to commit suicide is a mortal sin on the part of both parties, and allowing someone to die when you could do something to prevent it through ordinary means is a mortal sin, and mortal sins send us to hell forever. We know, of course, that suicide is against the natural law because all living things strive to live. That's what we see in nature. If you've ever gone fishing and you've caught an eel, and you'll see that eel flips and whips all over the place, it fights like fury to live. The fish you catch, it fights like fury to live. If you corner an animal, it fights like mad to live. We see people who are extremely sick fighting with everything they've got. Self-preservation is our strongest instinct. So to deliberately take our life or to ask someone to help us take our life is against the natural law. Suicide is also against the divine law. As Aquinas says, God alone is the Lord of death and life, for by his decrees both the sinful and the righteous die. We did not make ourselves. We did not give ourselves our own existence. Because, as Dr. Waters would say, if this was the case, then we would have to exist before we existed in order to give ourselves existence, which is absurd. We have existence that's given us at every instant from God. God not only created us, but he keeps us in existence through an ever-present act of his will. Man has no right to take his own life because it's not really his own life. It's given by God, and he must return it to God when God calls. And the most frightening aspect of this growing euthanasia movement is, from what I can see and from talking to people in the profession, medical students, nursing students are no longer fully trained in what California medicine calls the old Western ethic, that each life has transcendent value, but in the new situation ethics of the new paganism, a quality of life approach that places a relative value on human life, not an absolute value. And as I said, I'm not saying that every doctor and nurse has this mindset, but it's getting worse. It's getting worse. And though to examine this in detail would take us too far afield, our young people in universities, even Catholic universities, have been taught for the past 40 years that the moral law is relative and not absolute. There's always an exception. Abortion is not always wrong. Homosexual acts, not always wrong. Assisted suicide, euthanasia, not always wrong. The collapse in true Catholic teaching was a direct result of the liberal revolution that followed the Second Vatican Council, which caused a breakdown in doctrine, breakdown in moral teaching, and a breakdown in church discipline, to the point where we end up with modernist morals theologians, the Charles Kerrins, the Joseph Fuchs, the Richard McCormicks, the Richard McBrien, and hordes of others of their species who teach that birth control, homosexual acts, abortion, euthanasia can be permissible. The hierarchy, whose duty it is to stamp out these deviations for the good of the flock entrusted to them, they allow these deviations to continue. I mean, with respect, it took 20 years, nearly 20 years, for the Vatican to silence Father Charles Kerrin. Nearly 20 years. And those, even though he's been silenced, sort of, those who teach a similar corrupt doctrine run rampant in Catholic universities. So that now in most so-called Catholic institutions, and this is certainly the case in North America, this perversion of the moral law is now the predominant teaching. In too many places, the traditional doctrine against abortion is shunned as absolutist and extremist. So this brings us back to the story I opened with the bishops of Brazil. Bishop Pestana told the bishops, when Bishop Pestana brought up about abortion, they denounced him. They said to him, let's throw in the towel, give up, let's not waste our time on such things. So in closing, I want to take a closer look. We're wrapping it up now. I'm going to take a closer look of what these bishops treat with indifference. In the United States, there's a young woman named Abby Johnson. She's probably about 29 or 30 at this point. She had run a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic in Texas. In fact, she had been with Planned Parenthood for 8 years. She was recruited out of college. She had bought the whole pro-abortion jargon that abortion is a woman's right, that the unborn baby feels no pain. Though she did have reservations about late-term abortions. So one day in 2009, due to a personnel shortage, she was asked to assist with an ultrasound-guided abortion, something that she had never been part of before. So you have to hold the probe over the where the baby is, and then you can see everything going on the screen here. So she held the probe over the stomach of the young mother having the abortion, and what she saw on the screen was a perfectly formed baby. She didn't say from head to foot, she said from face to foot, about 13 weeks old. She then saw the insertion of the abortion tool, the cannula. It's a straw-shaped instrument attached to the end of the suction cup. And she saw the baby react. She saw the baby jerk its little foot back, and it was kind of kicking, trying to get away from this invader. As the cannula pressed in, she writes, the baby began struggling to turn and twist away. Then the abortionist told the nurse to turn on the suction. In fact, you know what the abortionist said? He said, beam me up, Scotty. He's making a joke of it. Turn on the suction. And Johnson then describes one of the most horrifying scenes that a person could witness, and it converted her instantly, on the moment, from pro-abortion to pro-life. Here's what she says. She says, the cannula was already being rotated by the doctor, and now I could see the tiny body violently twisting with it. For the briefest moment, it looked as if the baby was being wrung like a dishcloth, twirled and squeezed, and then the little body crumpled and began disappearing into the cannula before my eyes. I saw the tiny, perfectly formed backbone sucked into the tube, then everything was gone. Close quote. See, this is what abortion is. The butchering and murder of unborn babies in the mother's womb. The little body crumpled and sucked out of the womb by a vacuum. And it is this high-tech barbarism that the bishops of Brazil and other national conferences have decided they're not going to fight anymore. And I am one of many members of the faithful who see this as a scandal, a supreme dereliction of duty, because there is plenty a bishop can do if he wants to, and we have to pray for them if he has the courage to take the heat. Let's take a look at what our fathers have taught us. We know that the great St. Bernard and Peter the Venerable taught that in the duty to fight error, the church has two main weapons, preaching and excommunication. St. Thomas Aquinas noted that the church must strike criminals, not by the material sword, but by the spiritual sword. And that spiritual sword, if need be, is excommunication. And the sword of excommunication, this most severe punishment, is in itself a work of mercy. Because first, it's a no-nonsense attempt to correct the erring Catholic who's being excommunicated. Second, it reinforces to the faithful the gravity of these crimes, in this case, against human life. And third, it serves to prevent many Catholics from committing these crimes. Now, we're all here at this conference to promote the Fatima message, and especially to urge the Pope to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart, so that we will be granted what Our Lady promised as a result of that consecration, a huge turnaround, and history will suddenly take a different course, which is the conversion of Russia and a period of peace granted to the world. This triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart will crush the heads of the anti-life forces promoting abortion, population control, and euthanasia. In fact, the ever-growing plague of abortion and euthanasia is proof in itself that the consecration is still not done, because the killing of the elderly, the terminally ill, the wholesale slaughter of unborn babies, 3,000 abortions per day in the United States alone, all of this will not be a defining mark of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. This is a clear indication that the consecration has not been done. Now, that being said, however, we cannot just sit and wait for Our Lady's triumph and do nothing in the meantime. Sure, we have to pray, but ora et labora, as St. Benedict says, we must pray and work, pray and act. Opposing these evils with all our strength is a duty we have to perform, but we in the Catholic laity can only do so much. Priests, bishops, please heed St. Bernard and St. Peter the Venerable. Please use the swords of true preaching and excommunication. And if not excommunication, then please at least deny the sacraments to pro-abortion Catholic politicians who support abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, so-called same-sex marriage. But unfortunately, there are too many bishops in my own country who cower from refusing communion to pro-abortion politicians. In Albany, we have Archbishop Hubbard. We have a governor who's a so-called practicing Catholic who's not even married to the woman he's living with. He's shacking up with this woman, not even married. He's pro-abortion, and he's fighting now for so-called the legalization of same-sex marriage. And when they asked the Bishop of Albany, will you deny this man communion? He's not part of, he's a public sinner. Hubbard says, well, I don't get involved with that. That's between him and God. It's a public statement. Archbishop Worrell of Washington, D.C., and others have claimed that refusing communion to a pro-abortion Catholic politician is not really a pastoral solution. Well, you contrast this with St. John of the Cross, father and doctor of the church, who did not mince words in this regard. St. John Chrysostom said to his priests, quote, "It is necessary that I address myself, that you may distribute the sacred gifts with great caution. For your punishment will not be light, should you knowingly admit any to communion whom you know to be unworthy of it. Unworthy of it. Our Lord's blood will be required at thy hand. And even though he were a general or a governor, even he who wears the crown, should he draw near unworthy, forbid him, for higher is your authority than his." So we repeat the commandments of God, the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, which is properly understood as thou shalt not directly take the life of the innocent and the helpless. This is a command by God that today's anti-life forces defy. They defy it. They hate it. I will not serve. What we witness here is the emergence of naturalism, the emergence of the new paganism, the institutionalization of revolution, which, as you remember earlier, which is the hatred of all order not established by man, and in which he himself is not both king and God. I never use the term culture of death. I never use that term. Because since the time of Adam and Eve, and them bringing death into the world through the original sin, we've lived in the culture of death. No, what we live in now is a culture of murder. Abortion, sterilization, vasectomy, euthanasia, suicide, which is the result of naturalism that has no place for God, and a result of the new paganism that has no respect for what our fathers taught us. So let us pray for strength, continue our daily rosary, our 5 first Saturdays of reparation, our devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, including constantly petitioning for the consecration to the Immaculate Heart. And let us study so that we grow in knowledge of the truth and in knowledge of the enemy. Let us combat this culture of murder in all its forms by whatever legitimate means we have. And let us wage this fight with a strong sense of purpose, of perseverance, and with a firm spirit of battle joy. Thank you for your attention.